For centuries, skeptics have argued that the biblical giants were a metaphor, an exaggeration, a useful invention. Then, a document appeared that no theologian wrote and that no believer needed to fabricate to defend their faith. In the year 1250 BC, a scribe in the service of the pharaoh wrote a tactical warning for his soldiers in Canaan. I didn't know that this text, 3,000 years later, would change the way the world reads the Old Testament. If the giants walked through Canaan, someone else must have seen them, and someone else did see them. The evidence does not come from religious texts, but from a military report written by Egyptian scribes in the year 1250 BC. This document was not written to glorify any god or to justify any particular territorial conquest. It was written to warn royal soldiers about a real threat at a mountain pass in the region of Canaan. The scribe describes warriors with wild faces and heights of between 8 and 9 cubits, equivalent to nearly 4 meters. That text lacks poetry and theology. It is a tactical assessment of a threat the army needed to understand clearly. And that threat coincides with a disturbing precision with what the biblical texts describe in that same territory. Egypt and Israel documented giants in Canaan during the same historical period, completely independently of each other. But this story does not begin in Canaan or in Egypt. It begins thousands of years earlier, in a city that today is just dust. There is a line that connects the oldest Sumerian clay tablets with the warriors who terrorized Canaan. When that line becomes visible, the story of the Nephilim stops seeming like a legend and takes on a completely different dimension. To understand it, it is necessary to go back to the origins of written civilization, to Mesopotamia and its first cities. In ancient Mesopotamia, over 4,000 years ago, the Sumerians described beings they called Anunnaki. That name literally means those who came down from heaven to earth, and the texts do not treat them as abstract metaphors. They are described as beings who ruled over humans, communicated with them, and, in certain cases, mingled with them. In the texts of Atrahasis, a class of these beings called the EGG violently rebelled against their celestial superiors. That rebellion was not political or economic in its origin. It was carnal, because the EGG took human women and fathered children. Those children were different from any known human, larger, stronger, bearers of a knowledge that humans did not possess. The pattern is structurally identical to that described in Genesis, but narrated with different vocabulary and in another tradition. The Watchers of the Book of Enoch descend to Mount Hermon and unite with human women against the explicit will of the divine. From that union, the Nephilim are born, mixed beings who gain power, knowledge, and a presence that paralyzes onlookers. Metallurgy, astronomy, and warfare techniques are consistent in the knowledge conveyed by Sumerian texts and the Book of Enoch. It is not about two mythologies that evolved towards the same symbols by chance or by known cross-literary influence. These are two distinct traditions that seem to record the same historical phenomenon with culturally different names. Both traditions agree that this phenomenon ended in a global catastrophe aimed at erasing all that had been created. The flood, in biblical and Sumerian tradition, was not just a natural disaster, but a deliberate correction of order. However, Genesis contains a brief phrase that changes everything that seems to conclude the account of the universal flood. Genesis 6:4 states that the Nephilim existed before the flood and also after it, without any further explanation in the text. That statement, discreet and almost casual, raises one of the most difficult questions to resolve in all known biblical exegesis. If the flood extinguished all life outside the ark, how is it possible that the Nephilim had descendants in the world afterwards? Biblical texts do not respond directly, but Sumerian documents provide a clue that researchers have pointed out. The Sumerian Kings List is one of the most enigmatic historical documents that archaeology has uncovered to this day. Lists the kings who ruled Mesopotamia before and after the flood with a very precise and deliberate chronological distinction. The pre-Diluvian kings ruled for tens of thousands of years, figures that no conventional historical framework can support. The post-Diluvian kings have shorter reigns, more consistent with the human timescale that history can verify. Among the names on that list is one known worldwide, though many don't recognize it as a historically real figure. Gilgamesh is not only the protagonist of a literary epic, he is a verified king who ruled Uruk around 2700 BC. The Sumerians described him as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, with height and strength beyond any normal parameters. He had access to knowledge from the world before the flood, a wisdom that was expected to have vanished. That detail is the most significant of all. He was not simply a powerful warrior, but an active bearer of pre-Diluvian heritage. The Babylonians, direct heirs of the Sumerian tradition, developed their history between the years 1800 and 1600 BC. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, he and Enkidu enter a sacred forest that humans were forbidden to enter. They face Humbaba, a terrifying being with a face like entrails, a divine guardian placed there by the gods. Only the intervention of an external supernatural force could immobilize Humbaba enough for Gilgamesh to defeat him. The narrative pattern is identical to that of the biblical giants, semi-divine beings that guard territories beyond human reach. Gilgamesh, the conqueror, is not entirely human. He has at least one parent of divine origin. Its semi-divine nature implies that the flood did not restore the divide between the celestial and the human realms. Something endured after the catastrophe, be it a lineage, inheritance, or knowledge to recreate the forbidden union. And that something emerged again centuries later in the territory that both the Egyptians and the Israelites called Canaan. Before reaching Canaan, there is another node in this network that conventional analyses systematically and strikingly overlook. Sumerian texts place the Anunnaki in Eridu, identified by archaeologists as the oldest known human city. Eridu is real. Excavations in southern Iraq show its oldest layers date to the 6th millennium BC. The texts associate that place with the transmission of knowledge from the Anunnaki to the first human rulers of Mesopotamia. According to Sumerian texts and the Book of Enoch, that knowledge was the root issue the flood aimed to address. The geographical and thematic convergence between both traditions is too precise to be dismissed as a mere narrative coincidence. Two civilizations separated by centuries and cultural borders describe the same process with the same invariant causal structure. Celestial beings descend, transmit forbidden knowledge, mingle with humans, engender hybrid offspring. Catastrophe ensues. In both traditions, the process continues beyond the flood, showing clear continuity in the world that follows the waters. That continuity is what the Egyptian texts confirm, in a way that no apologetic argument could have fabricated on its own. Shortly after the flood, the Egyptians compiled a list of enemies in Canaan for strictly military purposes. On that list appears a name that caught the attention of scholars when comparing it to the biblical texts of the Book of Numbers. The name Leanik, or Ia Anak, bears a notable phonetic similarity to the Anakim in the biblical text of the Old Testament. The Anakim are the sons of Anak in Genesis and Numbers, direct descendants of the Nephilim who existed before the flood. Different cultures often use phonetic variations of the same name to refer to the same group or lineage. What is statistically significant is that two independent civilizations document giants in the exact same territory. This is precisely what occurs when comparing Egyptian documents with the biblical accounts in Numbers chapter 13. The spies sent by Moses returned from Canaan with a report that paralyzed an entire army made up of seasoned veterans. They were not novice recruits. They were men shaped by years of travel and survival in the harshest desert conditions. His depiction of the Anakim was not a poetic embellishment or a tactic to evade battle due to fear or strategy. They said they felt like locusts in front of those beings, an image that conveys something deeper than just a difference in height. That collapse of self-efficacy in trained warriors is not solely explained by the physical advantage of a taller enemy. And that same type of response appears in Sumerian texts when humans confront the Anunnaki directly. It also appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh when the characters approach Humbaba in the dark interior of the forbidden and sacred forest. It's not fear of a greater enemy, but the unsettling encounter with something from a reality beyond human understanding. If the Nephilim and the Anakim were simply exceptionally tall men, that consistent psychological response would lack coherence. But if they carried something more, a presence, a hybrid nature, an active inheritance of the pre-Diluvian, then fear makes sense. The most common skeptical argument is that Israeli spies lied to avoid fighting against the inhabitants of Canaan. That argument has a structural weakness that independent historical documents highlight with direct evidence. The Egyptian report from 1250 BC was not written to justify any Israeli withdrawal or any military defeat. Scribes serving the pharaoh created it to train Egyptian soldiers against a documented threat encountered in the field. The Egyptian army was not an institution that allowed itself to inflate imaginary threats in its strategic intelligence analyses. The pharaoh's decisions depended on the accuracy of those reports, and deliberate inaccuracy had serious and immediate consequences. When that army documents warriors of exceptional stature in Canaan, the information deserves to be taken seriously by any researcher. Two independent sources, one religious and one secular, report the same phenomenon in the same location and historical period. That is not definitive proof in a forensic sense, but it is evidence that cannot be ignored with basic intellectual honesty. This evidence is greatly strengthened when the geographical scope extends beyond Egypt and Israel to the ancient world. The Greeks had the Titans, colossal beings born from the union of gods and humans in a primordial time before the present. The Hittites recorded in their chronicles the existence of superhuman warriors linked to deities that inhabited sacred mountains. The Babylonians created the vast epic of Gilgamesh, featuring a semi-divine hero at the heart of their cultural story. Cultures that did not share sacred texts or religious systems converged on the same type of narrative with the same internal structure. It is not cross-literary influence, but parallel historical memory of a phenomenon that different civilizations witnessed separately. When such different cultures converge on the same elements, the hypothesis of collective invention loses all reasonable credibility. Hybrid descent, forbidden knowledge, global catastrophe. Subsequent return, the structural scheme is invariant everywhere. That invariant scheme across such different traditions as Sumeria, Egypt, Israel, Greece, and Hittite demands a deeper explanation. The clearest explanation though uncomfortable for any ideology, is that all those traditions reference something real. Not necessarily in the fantastic terms in which some versions narrate it, but rather in its most basic historical and structural core. There is an element in all these stories that no purely rationalist explanation has been able to satisfactorily resolve to this day. The fear these beings instilled was not proportional to their measurable physical advantage over trained and properly armed warriors. In the ancient world, a 2-meter-tall man in individual combat was a significant psychological factor, but not an absolute one. The armies of antiquity regularly faced larger, more numerous, or better-equipped enemies, and they often defeated them. In confronting the Anakim, Nephilim, and similar figures in other cultures, the response was fundamentally different. It wasn't a negative tactical assessment. It was a deep realization of something fundamentally foreign to the natural order. That dimension, consistently present in all the narratives, is what distinguishes these stories from ordinary war chronicles. And it is also what explains why the biblical writers did not include these accounts as marginal folkloric curiosities. Genesis 6:1-4 exists as an active and deliberate warning, not as narrative decoration or as a concession to the folklore of any era. Biblical writers knew the Epic of Gilgamesh, as it was widely circulated in written form across the Near East at that time. They framed their warning so that any reader from that culture would understand the specific danger being pointed out. Gilgamesh was not just a powerful king. He embodied a system of knowledge that transcended the boundaries set by the divine. A system that offered immortality and ultimate power for crossing boundaries that should never be crossed under any circumstances. That is exactly the same pattern that the Anakim represent in Canaan centuries later, with the same strategic territory as the setting. Canaan was not neutral. It was the meeting point for military, trade, and cultural roots of the ancient world. Whoever controlled that territory controlled the flow of people, ideas, and resources between Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Eastern Mediterranean. The presence of giants in Canaan, documented by both Egyptians and Israelites, does not appear to have been geographically accidental. It was strategic in a sense that transcends conventional human geopolitics and points to something difficult to categorize precisely. And that explains why the two most documented powers of the time recorded the same phenomenon in that very central territory. Of all the stories of giants from the ancient world, the Egyptian and biblical ones are the most sober and documentarily accurate. There are no dragons or mythical tales, only military reports, enemy lists, and chronicles of field reconnaissance. That documentary sobriety is what makes them more significant for any historical analysis that aims to have real, methodological rigor. The most extravagant stories come from traditions that amplified the phenomenon, with layers of mythology added successively. The most sober, the closest to the language of administrative and military records, are precisely the Egyptian and biblical ones. And that sobriety makes them less susceptible to having been distorted by religious enthusiasm or political propaganda. Now, what does all this mean when the entirety of the available evidence is observed from an integrated historical perspective? It means that the story of the Nephilim is not an isolated phenomenon within a single particular religious tradition of the Near East. It serves as a central hub in a network that spans entire civilizations, centuries of history, and thousands of kilometers. The Sumerian Anunnaki, the Watchers of Enoch, the Nephilim of Genesis, Gilgamesh of Uruk, and the Anakim of Canaan are nodes of that network. Different names in different languages for a phenomenon that the great ancient civilizations documented separately and without contact. The question that those documents leave open is not whether the sources existed. They are too consistent to deny them without argument. The real question is what they were, what knowledge they carried, and why they generated that specific terror in militarily trained witnesses. The texts do not provide a definitive answer, but coherently indicate a direction that all traditions share with each other. There was an order before the flood that was deliberately interrupted, and part of that order returned when the waters receded. That return took different forms. The semi-divine king in Sumeria, the giant clan in Canaan, the colossal warrior in Greek tradition. But in all cases, the structure is the same. Something that should not be present in the human world manifested itself in him again. And that manifestation was documented not only by believers, but also by the officials of the most powerful army of all known antiquity. That return is what the Egyptian report from 1250 BC documents unintentionally in the cold language of military intelligence. And this is what Genesis warns in one sentence, that read with all this evidence no longer seems enigmatic. The line that connects Eridu with Mount Hermon, with Uruk, with Hebron, and with the passage of the Egyptian report is historically coherent. It is not a geographic line, but a transmission of something the flood's waters could not fully extinguish. What that line exactly conveyed, and whether it remains active in the current world, is a question that the texts do not fully resolve. Among all those cases, that of Og, king of Bashan, deserves special attention due to the specificity of the biblical detail. The text describes his iron bed with precise measurements of 9 cubits long and 4 wide, a figure that is not decorative. Those dimensions have no narrative meaning in a religious text, unless they are based on something physically verifiable. King Og appears in the Book of Deuteronomy as one of the last survivors of the Rephaim, another post-Diluvian giant clan. The Rephaim are mentioned in several books of the Old Testament as a distinct group from the Anakim, but of a similar nature. His presence in Bashan, east of the Jordan River, expands the geographical map of the giants beyond the central territory of Canaan. And that expanded geographical map coincides, once again, with the areas of influence documented in the Egyptian military records. The Greeks, for their part, developed a version of this same story that spread for centuries in Mediterranean culture. The Titans were colossal beings of divine origin who ruled the world before being defeated and confined underground. His defeat by the Olympic gods mirrors, in Greek terms, the same cosmic correction that the flood represents in the Bible. And the war between the gods and the Titans, the Titanomachy, preserves the memory of a conflict between different orders of reality. The same happens with the Greek Nephilim of the Hellenistic period, the giants of the Gigantomachy who attempted to storm Olympus. All these narratives, from Sumeria to Greece, share a common grammar: the transgression of a limit, the catastrophe, and the vestige. The vestige is always the most disturbing evidence that the transgression was not completely reversed by any catastrophe. The Anakim in Canaan are that vestige in the biblical texts, independently confirmed by the military report from Egypt. Gilgamesh in Uruk is that vestige in Sumerian texts, bearer of a knowledge that the flood should have buried forever. And the consistency of that pattern across such different cultures is not an accident of human narrative, nor an effect of imagination. It is the documentary record of an event captured by witnesses from various traditions who did not coordinate with each other. What exactly happened in all its dimensions is something that the documents indicate, but that no ancient text fully reveals. Perhaps that deliberate opacity in the texts is itself the most eloquent warning the ancient world left us. because the texts that warn most insistently are always the ones that say the least about what one must remain vigilant against. If you want to keep exploring what ancient world documents reveal about this period, subscribe so you don't miss what's next.